Hello and welcome to this episode of Kennedy Saves the World. I know a burning question many of you have. Who are the women who helped the Union win the Civil War? That is a great question. Gerri Willis is here today. She has written a phenomenal book, Lincoln's Lady Spymaster, Elizabeth Van Lew, a woman you probably never heard of who actually played a very big part as a Southern abolitionist who helped the Union ultimately
win the war.
Yes.
She developed a spy ring.
Keep the country together.
She did, and she was appalled at the idea that Virginia would not be part of the Union. She was so proud of her Commonwealth heritage, and she hated slavery.
Yes.
She was the great-granddaughter of a man who founded a circle in Philadelphia to oppose slavery. Mm-hmm. So she was very familiar with these ideas of being anti-slavery. Her mother was anti-slavery, and yet her family owned slaves. Mm-hmm. So there's all kinds of complications in this book.
Yes, and it is often a complicated story, especially in the South, where many people assume that there weren't a lot of abolitionists, and it's certainly not someone from a privileged family who, learned the art of flirtation in her coming out
old-fashioned way.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so I want to know, first and foremost, have you always been a student of Civil War history, and how did you settle upon her story? How did you come to find out about Elizabeth Van Lew?
So back during COVID, a lot of our young female producers were fearful about the lockdowns. They were really upset. And I was kind of surprised by that. And I thought, American women have done really cool things over hundreds of years. Yeah. I need to tell one of those stories. So I went on a search. I uncovered literally scores of very cool American women. Yeah. But I settled on Elizabeth Van Lew, A, because she's not well known. B, she had a diary, so you could hear her voice.
Okay,
exactly
so you had a very
important
important primary source.
Yeah, I had an important primary source, and her story to me was riveting. And to tell you the truth, through the process of this, and I don't know if you could tell by reading it, I kept uncovering things that I didn't expect. I thought I was writing a book about a little old Southern lady who ran around the city taking scraps of paper to Union folks, and in fact, she was this badass who infiltrated the Confederate War Department, had a spy inside
Jefferson Davis's home,
yes,
which was fascinating.
Yes, so that woman, this is a highly debated concept, this whole idea.
And you kind of laid that out in the book.
Yes.
And that was a critical piece in her spy ring, was having a woman who was, essentially her slave, who worked in her home, whom she educated and had baptized and, really took in as a family member, one of her most trusted companions. And, Elizabeth Van Lew, because she came from so much money in Richmond, she knew Jefferson Davis's wife.
Yeah, and she went and visited her and said, I hear that you have need of a slave. And she was given the okay. So she sends this woman who she absolutely adores, a beautiful black young woman who, lives essentially free in her household. I know no one's going to agree with me about that, but it's a really complicated story about how she was educated. She was sent to Liberia, comes back to Virginia. And if you come back to Virginia at that time, you had to be a slave. You couldn't come back as a free woman. Mm-hmm. So she went and lived in Elizabeth's house. She helped her spy. And she tapped what they call the slave network. So in Richmond, remember, these aren't vast plantations. Slaves are living and next to their masters all the time in the household. Mm-hmm. So they hear everything.
Yes.
And
they didn't have insulation.
And people did not censor what they were saying in front of slaves.
Isn't that interesting? I thought about that as you sort of laid out how she would have gone about her duties throughout the day. And Elizabeth was like, all right, Mary, I need you to go into Jefferson Davis's office, who was a sickly man at the time, and I need you to look for notes, and I need you to memorize things that you see and conversations that you hear. And what was the system they came up with to transmit that information?
Well, there was an elaborate system said to translate the information, which included her writing notes that were sewn into the garments of Jefferson Davis's wife, and then moved to someone else who would then, find that and uncover it. Or she could put I believe it's a red piece of fabric hanging on the clothesline to notify people like, I've got something, come, you've got to pick up the clothes so I can tell you what we have that's new. Mm-hmm. So there were elaborate ruses that were developed. And this is, this was just
but this is all
variety.
very bold stuff for an unmarried Southern belle.
It's bold stuff.
How did Elizabeth Van Lew get to be so bold? Like, what was it about her personality that gave her the intelligence and the confidence to carry stuff off like this? Because, as you point out at the time, they were hanging spies.
They were hanging spies. She was afraid all the time. You read her diary, you hear the fear in her voice. She thinks people are coming for her and her family all the time. And there's a scene where Confederate detectives do come to her front door. And at the time, in her attic, she has 3 Union officers who are on the lam. They are running. They're going to go to the north. Yeah. And she's desperately afraid that these Confederate detectives are going to find them. It doesn't happen, but it's a pretty good scene in the book. So Elizabeth Van Lew is a woman who has been raised by parents who love her, educate her, provide her with books, send her to Philadelphia to get educated. Mm-hmm. They give her a sense of her, I hate to use this phrase, own agency, right? Mm-hmm. They want her to do whatever she does. Her father gives her $10,000, which was a lot of money at that time, in her own name. This typically does not happen. If you got money as a young woman, as soon as you got married, you had to give it to your husband.
That's your dowry.
Yeah, baby. So that's fascinating. But her personality is fascinating because on the one hand, she's really critical of people. Mm-hmm. She can be kind of harsh, right? And you hear her talking about the Unionists, the men who will do nothing to stand in the way of these plantation owners who want to secede. And she's really angry with them. On the other hand, she's incredibly generous.
Yes.
And she gives away all of her wealth during the course of the war. And she gives it to people who have nothing, to feed them, to give them representation when the Confederates come for them, when the rebels decide that, maybe they should be in prison. And in fact, it's in prison that she goes and gets this spy ring. Mm-hmm. So when I was doing the book, this was a woman who was almost buried by history. Her story was very nearly lost. And I really wanted to bring it to the fore. But I have to tell you a story I think you'll like. She was well known in Richmond, not so much the rest of the country. She had been involved in a couple of national stories in newspapers, magazine, Harper's. She refused to write autobiography, which a lot of spies did right after the war. She wouldn't do it.
Yep.
She was afraid of reprisals, right? So 100 years after the Civil War, there's an NSA agent, an analyst, poking around the National Archives, and he comes across this room, dusty, there are stacks of paper to the ceiling, and there's literal red tape holding them together. He opens them up and starts looking, and he finds that they are the records of the Union spies from the war. These are records that were overseen by a fellow named George Sharp, who was a New York attorney, brainiac, eventually busts up Tammany Hall later in his career. And he has put all this together. In those records, we hear about Elizabeth Van Lew. And when this NSA agent writes a 600-page history of Civil War spying, he says that her spy ring was the most productive of any spy ring in the entire war on the North or the South side.
Wow. That's incredible. And, it made me wonder how many spies were women, because obviously men on both sides were so necessary to fight this protracted war. Right. And the dedication in the book is one from Abraham Lincoln to, it's a love letter to the women who helped the country, helped keep the country together and help win the war. So how many of her fellow spies were actually women at this time?
There were a lot of women spies. There were a lot of Confederate women spies. Remember, Elizabeth Van Lew is a Union spy. Mm-hmm. But some of them, I've got to tell you, people were just looking for the spotlight, the limelight. They wanted a little press, right? Like Belle Boyd in Northern Virginia.
And you said you almost wrote about her.
I almost wrote about her. They call her the fastest woman in Virginia. Mm-hmm. So she got information by sidling up to those, Union soldiers, and they would tell her anything she wanted to hear. But ultimately, she didn't have that much of an impact. She got a lot of press. but she really didn't have an impact. I wanted somebody who made a difference. And Elizabeth was able, as I said, to get spies embedded in critically important places. By the end of the war, she was essentially running the prison system.
Yes.
She had so many people on the payroll, she bribed everybody. So that was impressive. And she helped Grant stage the final assault of the war, her information that she sent. Now, keep in mind, in the middle of the war, when she's sending all this information, it's all encoded, right? Mm-hmm. But by late in the war, she's handwriting on little scraps of paper that she's giving to her slaves. She's giving to people who work for her, and they're hiding it in the soles of their shoes or somewhere else on their body, hoping they won't get caught. And she's telling them what I thought was so interesting. We need a raid on Richmond to free these Union folks who have been held in prisons here under horrible conditions.
Don't go anywhere. More Kennedy Saves the World right after this.
Okay, so it's interesting because, I've heard and read about Andersonville for a long time, which was the most notorious prison.
Georgia.
In the South, yes. And that's where a third of the Union prisoners who were kept there died of either starvation or disease. I mean, it was a brutal, brutal place.
So in Richmond,
yes,
there were...
Libby Prison, which was, just a 10-minute walk for Elizabeth Van Lew. Tell me about that prison and what that meant to her spy ring.
So she could see it from her house. She was very familiar with it. She actually paraded in front of it all the time. Why? Because she had told people inside the prison that were on her payroll, tell the men inside, the Union soldiers inside who are being held prisoner, tell them to look out. I'm the person they want to look for if they're trying to run away. So she was kind of advertising her services. Mm-hmm. She, and just as a point of fact, they painted the first floor of that 2-story brick building white. Why? So that if people were escaping, they could see them to shoot them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she wanted to help those people. She did a lot to help them. There was also an island in the middle of the James River where soldiers and officers were held outside, sometimes under tents, sometimes they didn't even have a tent. Oof. And the pictures that you see from that, and there are a lot of them, these people looks like Auschwitz.
Yeah.
It's horrific to think people were held like that. I have to tell you, though, Richmond itself was suffering mightily by the end of the war.
Yeah.
There was famine, inflation. It was a very difficult time.
I'm sure there were a lot of people there who also wanted the war to end, and that's why it's a war of attrition. Like, please, like, we can no longer withstand this. Like, so many people are dying. We have given up hope that we are going to keep slavery and the Confederacy intact. Please.
An important point here, and I think she is an example of this. People think that the South was monolith in its support of the Confederacy and slavery. It's not true at all. In fact, there were lots of people she could work with. Richmond itself was a very industrialized city. There were people there from Scotland and Ireland and Germany. She recruited some of those folks into her spy ring. There were Unionists who were just afraid but would help her anyway. Mm-hmm. There were lots of people, and as the war went on, there were even more who were not signed on with the Confederate agenda.
What would have happened if Elizabeth Van Lew didn't put this spy ring together? What would have happened to the war?
I think it would have been longer. It would have been more painful. More people would have died. She sent many of the slaves that she owned to the North and saved their lives. She saved a lot of lives.
Yeah. I mean, she really, she could have amassed an even greater fortune during the war, and she pretty much gave it all away to the point where at the end of her life it was like Grey Garden. She was destitute.
She was destitute. Grant appointed her postmaster of Richmond, which was very unusual at the time, at the end of her life. And she filled the most important jobs with black men who had worked for her during the war. And all of Richmond was aghast. People were upset. But she lost all of her money. And it's so funny listening to her voice during that time, because she really expected the people of Richmond to eventually embrace her, and they never did. And what I found so fascinating, she lived in a mansion, a fabulous mansion, where Supreme Court justices came, where Edgar Allan Poe read The Raven to giggling Southern belles.
Wow.
And that house kind of fell into disrepair. She finally dies with a bust of Abraham Lincoln looking over her. What happens to that house several years later? They tear it down. They put up a school. Do they name it for her? No, they do not.
Yeah. And she sacrificed so much thinking that she was on the right side of history, thinking that when the war was over, she would be a heroine, but she was always a pariah. But I think it's so interesting, her love of Virginia.
Yes.
It's like she loved the Union, but she loved Virginia. And you could say the same for Robert E. Lee, because they assumed that he was going to fight on the side of the Union. Here was this famous U.S. Army general, and they assumed that he would command the Union Army. And he was like, absolutely not. I will not fight against my fellow Virginians. And so, Lee's name sort of extended through history. Grant's was almost extinguished, and hers as well. Do you think that there's a commonality between Grant and Elizabeth Van Lew in terms of the rediscovery of them?
Well, I hope she gets rediscovered, and that's what this book is all about. Grant has recently been rediscovered, thank goodness, because he was a true hero.
Amen.
And it's good to see him redeemed. I've done a lot of work on him and read a lot about him. I am amazed by him. He's got a home in northern New York, by the way, where he wrote his memoirs that you can actually go to.
Yes, his home in New Jersey in Long Branch was unfortunately torn down, because that's where he spent a lot of pleasant recreational time with his family. But yeah, it was in New York where he was dying from throat cancer and wrote his memoir.
An amazing story. Elizabeth, the day after Richmond fell, I have to tell this story because it's so much fun. I'll get back to him. But she ran outside with a flag that she had in the attic. And every time we added a state to the Union, she would sew one of the stars into the flag and proudly kept it. So when Richmond finally fell, and it's a famous story, the city was on fire, in ruins. I'm sure you've seen the pictures. She runs outside with her flag and hoists it up, and all of her neighbors come out and start yelling at her, right? And telling her they're going to burn her house down. And she says, if you touch one brick on my house, I'm going to send General Grant to come and get you. and they run away. So she was amazing. Grant comes to her home. We found a source among her spy ring who had written this book. Grant comes to the house, thanks her personally. He stays the night. They have a big dinner with a spy ring, a big celebration. He leaves the next day, leaves his calling card. She keeps his calling card for the rest of her life.
Oh, and then, she made the right gamble, because he obviously became president, almost a 3-term president. He was a 2-term president. And now people are rediscovering his legacy, and they can also learn all about Lincoln's lady spymaster. Gerri Willis is the author. The Untold Story of the Abolitionist Southern Belle Who Helped Win the Civil War. Phenomenal book, well-researched, and, hopefully one of many historical tomes from you.
I would love to do more. Tell me my next subject.
I know, that's the process of discovery for a historian.
It's difficult.
That's laborious.
It is. It's laborious, but it's also kind of fun.
Yeah.
I had a great time researching this.
Well, I had a great time reading all about this, and I can't wait to read what's more to come, and I'm very excited for people to make this discovery on your behalf. Thank you, Gerri.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Kennedy.
Absolutely. Lincoln's Lady Spymaster. Order it now. This has been Kennedy Saves the World, along with Gerri Willis. I'm Kennedy.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app. Oh, go ahead and leave me a review while you're there. I'd love to hear what you have to say. You've been listening to Kennedy Saves the World on the Fox News Podcast Network.